Wonderful. So thank you so much for that. Well, welcome and good evening, everyone. My name is Veronica Oplins. I'm president of the Philadelphia chapter of the Society of Architectural Historians. The Society of Architectural Historians promotes the study, interpretation, and conservation of architecture, design, landscapes, and urbanism worldwide for the benefit of us all. The Philadelphia chapter is part of this local, national, and international network. We welcome all interested parties, particularly those in the Philadelphia and Delaware Valley, and we're delighted to have you here this evening. I'm now going to turn this over to my colleague and friend and fellow board member, Kevin Block, to introduce our panelists, and that is our speaker and our discussant this evening. So thank you, everyone. Welcome. And Kevin, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Veronica. Good evening, everybody. I would first like to hold up my copy of Andy's book, The Everyday Life of Memorials, which is what Andy and Michael, who I'll introduce in a second, will be talking about this evening. I want to share in the chat here with the discount code that Princeton University Press shared with me to distribute at this talk. I'll find the link here to the book and share that in the chat as well. So Andy Shanken is professor of architectural history and the director of American Studies at UC Berkeley. He publishes on the topic of architecture and memory, the history of preservation, keywords in architecture, and the visual culture of architecture and planning. His book, 1940X, Architecture, Planning, and Consumer Culture on the American Home Front, published in 2009, examines anticipatory architecture on the American home front. A second book, Into the Void Pacific, published in 2015, is an architectural history of the 1939 World's Fair in San Francisco. And the new book, which I just showed everyone, is entitled The Everyday Life of Memorials, published by Zone Books last year in 2022. And it explores the meaning of memorials in daily life and their place within the development of modern cities. Michael Lewis, which you also see here, is joining us tonight, teaches modern architecture and American art at Williams College. And he's also the architecture critic for the Wall Street Journal. After receiving his BA from Haverford College in 1980 and 2 years at the University of Hanover in Germany, he received his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in 1989. He has taught at Bryn Mawr College, McGill University in Montreal, and the University of Natal in South Africa. His books include Frank Furness, Architecture and the Violent Mind, 2001, American Art and Architecture, 2006, and the prize-winning August Reichensperger, The Politics of the German Gothic Revival, 1993. Michael was a fellow of the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton, and in 2008 received the Guggenheim Fellowship to support the completion of City of Refuge, his study of millennial utopias. Lewis has been at Williams since 1993, and in 2008, he was named the Faison Pearson Stoddard Professor of Art. And on behalf of the chapter, we're very excited for your talk. Thanks very much for being with us, and I will hand over the mic.
You're muted, Mike.
Well, Andy, I think I've got to grill you. I think that's what people are expecting.
Okay.
First thing I think people should know is Andy and I have had the same professor of architecture 10 years apart. Barbara Miller Lane at Bryn Mawr was my first teacher of architectural history. And I think, Andy, yours 10 years later.
She was. And then David Brownlee was my first graduate professor. So we share that too. So it's completely inbred right now.
Yes, yes. Well, it's important that we don't get too friendly. There's got to be some clash here because that's what people want to see us rumble. Andy, okay. I don't know how many of our viewers right now, we've got 31. I don't know how many of them have seen your book. So I think they should have an idea about it. They should first of all know that we're going to do this like the Charlie Rose show. It's going to be a talk show, no images. We're going to go back and forth. And I'm glad that Kevin showed your book, because I don't know how many people have seen it, but let me try, Andy, to put into words what your book is about, and then you can correct me. The everyday life of memorials, as I understand it, is a kind of corrective to the idea that a memorial, a public memorial, is a fixed and static thing that once it's created, it takes its place in the world and lives happily ever after. And I have the sense that your book wants to say, okay, what happens when we can't picture Romeo and Juliet actually getting married and living happily there ever after. It's too ideal, because life is going to come in, and that idyllic happiness is going to be stressed at some point. So you're interested in what happens to the monuments as they go off to slumber, or their meaning to change, and how they sometimes come alive again. You talk about them going dormant and then opening up. Am I right that is basically the theme of the book?
Are we supposed to fight now, or can I agree with you?
Fight. Yeah, I'm
Okay.
giving you a softball pitch.
Yeah, no, that's good. That is right. I mean, I should just add one thing, in that this is the type of thing that was staring me in the face for so long, and I was not able to see it. And I think this happens to a lot of us, where we go through the world with blinders on, or we have a set of lenses through which we see the world. And I had to take some lenses off in order to see it. And what the lenses that I had to take off were kind of twofold. The first lens, if you can have double lenses, maybe one was shades and one were actually corrective lenses. The first pair told me that memorials were about commemoration, and the second pair told me that they are about political contestation. And so I kept looking for those things, because that's how people write about them and think about them. And then it suddenly hit me, after too long looking at them, that most of the time, most memorials are doing neither. They're part of everyday life. People are having a bologna sandwich on the step, or they meet there and don't think at all about the political or commemorative value of the monument. And that seemed like a small insight until I continued to unpack what that meant. So they are doing things when they're doing nothing, in other words, and they're doing a whole lot of stuff when they're doing nothing. It's not that they're dormant, it's that they go into a different state, let's say. And in that different state, they're serving a different purpose. And if I might claim, they're doing something that no other intervention in the built environment can do quite like they do.
One of the things that struck me about your book, and rereading it for this talk, is how many examples you have outside of the United States. And I had the sense that the monuments that we grew up with are, to a certain extent, invisible to us. Pious platitudes. We're not curious about them. We know they're there, but we don't study them. But you had to go to Germany. I mean, your Bismarck memorials, and you're in Klagenfurt. Is it possible that these unfamiliar things made you think differently about ours?
Well, yes, sure. Leaving home always makes you see the world in a different way. It heightens your awareness. Every crack in the sidewalk becomes meaningful sometimes after a long transcontinental flight. And sure, that happened. I also think I lived for a year in Mexico. And so two things were going on with this, Mike. One, very much consistent with what you're saying. New eyes were forced upon me by new situations. At the same time, I saw a set of conventions that I thought were international. So there were repetitions, memorials in traffic circles in Mexico, and then in Germany, and in France, in England, in the United States. And I began to think, well, we know a lot about the formal conventions of memorials. We know the shapes that they come in, but we haven't really looked at the conventions of placement. And that, to me, was really important, because so much of what we do when we remember something is put it in a place. And so I was interested in unpacking some of those conventions. Of course, the word convention, even that is an interesting word that works against us thinking in these terms, because convention is the worst thing in an architecture school, say, like I teach in at Berkeley. And yet convention, as you well know, comes from the Latin convenire. It's a coming together. It's a social pact, an agreement. And without those agreements, we lose coherence. We lose a kind of moral ground of agreement. And so I was interested in restoring some of that original sense of convention to unpacking the conventions of placement. But yes, going somewhere else defamiliarizes you with the way you're looking at things usually.
We're going to come back to moral agreement. That's
Okay.
a burning issue. But let me ask you, I think everyone out there wants to hear you answer a simple question. What is a memorial? You didn't define it. And I just heard you in one sentence referring to memorials and monuments interchangeably. Is there a distinction there? What are they? Just give us a working definition.
Yeah, so the working definition, which I don't really agree with, is that monuments are erected so that we may remember, and memorials are erected so that we don't forget. That's a kind of working definition. So we have the Washington Monument, but we have the Lincoln Memorial. We remember Washington in grand heroic terms, but we remember Lincoln with more pathos, let's say. There's a different emotional cast, a different set of processes, different commemorative values for these two types of objects. And yet, in practice, they overlap in all sorts of ways that are interesting. So some things called monuments clearly have commemorative value and go to the root of memorial. And some memorials are clearly monumental, or they operate like monuments. In fact, parts of the Lincoln Memorial are quite like a monument. It's a giant guy seated in a temple. And I'm often thinking of the root of the word monument, which is monere, and it really means warning or admonition. And either a memorial or a monument could do both of those. And monere shares a root. There's a common root for monument and monster. That is to say, the monster warns of something, of some potential tragedy, and monuments sometimes do that. It also shares a root with demonstrate. So monuments also demonstrate something. They put into practice in some public space something that needs to be demonstrated according to the public that erected it. I have more to say, but I feel that you have another question about that.
Let me push you more, because what you're saying, the wider a definition becomes, in a way, the less useful it is, because anything can help us remember. A simple sign on the wall. And for much of the 20th century, architects were excited about the idea of a living memorial. That is, it's something that commemorated or celebrated or remembered without being an object. Is there a useful distinction in thinking of memorials and monuments as physical things? Does that help us?
It could. I don't think it necessarily has to. I mean, we're in this funny place now where UNESCO now is interested in intangible heritage, and things that you and I wouldn't necessarily relate to as memorials are called memorials all the time. So I think there's a blur that's confounding right now that I'm not sure I can sort out completely. But I do think that there is a difference between erecting an object in a public space and saying that nearly dead language is going to be preserved because it is a memorial to the people who are soon to vanish. So I do think the fast and loose usage is not necessarily helping us determine these things. But I do think what happens in time and space is important, right? Particularly the idea that most memorials, when they are turned on a special day, so that time is taken out of everyday circulation and space is taken out of everyday circulation. They're removed and made special in some way.
The only one I can think of is Stonehenge, which activated on December 21st. But
well, the Letchens Cenotaph in England is a good example. Or the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier on Memorial Day becomes heightened in some way. This happens often with memorials, that a special day instigates something new in them.
Andy, I think everyone wants to hear your take on the most controversial monument of the year. Or memorial. We're just 3 months into the year, but everyone for a while was ablaze with the Embrace, the Martin Luther King Memorial in Boston. Is that good? What do we learn from that?
Well, maybe I should talk dispassionately first about it, and then talk more personally about it. So dispassionately, well, first of all, it doesn't help that it makes the New York Post online with a headline like "Woke Penis Statue Insults Black Community," right? And that was the headline. That's not me making that up. It is me sharing it. But that inflames things, and so
Well,
part of it is
hang on. Hang on.
Yeah.
I think maybe you should just explain, because I'm not sure everyone has a mental picture of what this
Okay.
sculpture is.
So it is from a photograph of the kings, the couple embracing. That's why it's called the embrace. And so it's from a photograph, which is a tactic that's quite common in memorials, to use a photograph as a link to something that really happened, so that there's some core reality that we're sold on. It's the illusion of reality, but it's still a link that's important. And it's a fragment of this photograph that has then been blown into a monumental sculpture. So there's a bunch of transformations happening from a photograph that's small to a monument in space, and then from a whole picture with a context into a fragment in that public space. And not everyone who sees it, of course, knows that history too. So it's asking a lot of people who see it. And from some angles, it's very hard to make out that that's what's happening. And in fact, there are angles from which it looks just like an abstraction, and others where it does look like what the New York Post said. It looks like it could be obscene. And there are moments where I thought it looks like Goya's Saturn devouring his son even. There's a hands holding up and what looks like a misshapen body part off even. So there are things happening in that are odd, but there are these very conventional uses of memorial strategies, one of which is the transformation of the photograph, which has been proven in the Iwo Jima memorial to be something very successful. That's not my cup of tea, that memorial, but it's undoubtedly iconic and undoubtedly effective, the Iwo Jima memorial of the soldiers lifting the flag on Mount Suribachi in Iwo Jima that everybody knows. Everybody knows it because it's so iconic. And then the other main strategy, yeah, go ahead.
Isn't the problem with embrace is that a photograph is a two-dimensional thing, and when you render it in 3 dimensions, just because something is beautiful from the front doesn't mean it's going to look good from the side, let alone the rear.
Right. Well, this is what's one of the differences between the Iwo Jima memorial and the embrace, is that Iwo Jima is frontally displayed. You can walk around it, and it's coherent in 360 degrees. You can circumambulate it, but one doesn't have to. You see it actually from the roadside, and it does get shrunken back into 2 dimensions quite well, whereas the embrace, partly because it's a fragment, cannot be reshrunk into 2 dimensions effectively. And when you walk around it, it's incoherent from some angles. So it's let's say a bad bad use of this technique, I would say.
Yeah.
It's the other technique I was going to say is sometimes described as prosthetic memory. A part of a body is used as an evocation of the whole, and this is doing that as well. And I just don't know that works either in this particular case. Yeah.
Well, it puts a void at the center. It seems to me that's the problem. If you have the disembodied arms in space, you have the muscle action of the embrace, but you don't have the person inside.
Yeah, I could imagine that being interesting. It just doesn't work in this case. So a vacancy, an absence could be really evocative in the case of a memorial. In fact, it could be done on purpose. And absence is a key way that memorials are often used. They use absence. But in this case, I don't think that it invites us, because of its formal properties, to fill that vacancy and to put ourselves in it. We are not going to be embraced by that embrace. It feels empty there rather than absent, let's say.
Do you think there are any 20th century memorials that got it right, that got it exactly right?
Oh, that's such a tough question. Wow. Let me deflect and let me weave a little bit and say that there are many that are incredibly evocative. There are some that I don't like that are incredibly effective. I think the Iwo Jima memorial is an example of that. I don't like it even a bit, but I have to admit that it's incredibly effective. Maybe the World War I memorial in Munich, which has a sepulchral aspect that's dug out of an area in the city in a great courtyard in front of a big public building. And you walk down steps and you're underground. And it's one of the first memorials I know that use that idea of going underground. And when you get there, you see a cadaverous body in soldier's outfit lying flat on a tomb. It's incredibly evocative. It's sentimental. It's full of emotion that it's trying to get something from you. And it's incredibly effective, I think, especially if I put on my historical imagination or try to think in terms of someone in 1920 seeing it, I think it would be deeply effective. Once these things get used, these strategies get used again and again, they lose some of their effectiveness. But I think that's a powerful memorial. And I think a lot of the memorials of fallen bodies, which now fall so flat to us, so to speak, they just look like a dead body. And why would someone put a dead body in the arms of a female figure usually? These must have been very effective when they were first put into public space, because the nature of death and of dead bodies was very different when they first appeared.
Yeah, German expressionism, all the Käthe Kollwitzes of mothers cradling dead sons, very, very powerful. You use the word sentimental in a way that told me of your disdain for the word, and yet something that appeals to our profoundest emotions. How do you make it not sentimental? It's about sentiment. What is the emotion that you don't want, and how do you prevent that?
Well, you don't want cloying emotions, and you don't want to impose emotions. You want to pull them out of somebody so that they feel honest, or they are honest, not so they feel honest. It's hard to think in this era of the manufactured heart what an honest emotion is, perhaps. And I think that probably in a moment, in an era when people had a more direct relationship with emotion and maybe were able to express it more publicly and outwardly, in a moment when with ostentatious death, where habits of dying were well worn and understood, and you were supposed to cry out loudly, that sort of thing, again, is part of a set of conventions that made people feel comfortable rather than uncomfortable. So public emotion, I do think that we now live in a moment in which the conventions of what is expressible publicly are up in the air, and that makes us uncomfortable expressing anything in public.
Now, it's interesting you say that, because one of the fault lines in your book, your book is not chronological, but everywhere you get the sense that in a secular age we are in free fall, that we're not exactly sure what our journey on earth and beyond means, and how we collectively mark it. And when that happens, if you don't have conventions, that the triumphal arch or the funereal wall or the obelisk, if you don't have that, and you're in an era of modern art, you have every artist inventing a completely independent new iconography, a new language of symbolism. And that doesn't work for the collective. And I think that's the problem of the embrace. It's a nifty idea, but it doesn't speak to a society. So I sense in all your later, in chapter after chapter, I get the sense of grasping for something that will give us what we once had in togetherness.
Yeah, and to be clear, I think there can be secular conventions. I don't think it's the loss of a religious life. And I think people can make social agreements around in non-religious terms. And people can come to artistic conventions also in ways that are not necessarily about religiosity or faith. And so I'm a secular person. But I do believe the idea that the lack of conventions, not just formal conventions, but social conventions of social practices. We don't know what we're supposed to do in front of a memorial. We need a script, and even the script changes. I've really wanted to study Memorial Day programs. They're hard to come by, just to see how they've changed over the last, since the Civil War, because since Direct Decoration Day, there have been Memorial Day programs. And to see exactly how people have constructed this kind of commemoration, how it's changed over time, and what sorts of things seem to be part of forging some sense of collective understanding about what we're all doing together when we remember.
what you said about secular conventions made me think about the Vietnam Memorial, Veterans Memorial by Maya Lin. Nobody expected that the day it opened, there'd be 2 customs created in an instant, taking rubbings of the names and leaving keepsakes and souvenirs there. And that's an example, I think you would call it one of the very successful ones in recent memory.
Yes, I would. I just taught it last week too. So I have too much in my head about it to say anything in a way. You know what I mean? My head is cluttered about it. Yeah, and then another set of conventions that comes out of the dissatisfaction with that memorial by some groups, which is to say the addition of certain figurative elements in some sort of dialogue with it. And then that becomes a convention that we see repeated at memorials again and again and again, like the Korean War Memorial. It wasn't enough to have a wall, they needed statues, and they needed a flag, and they needed a circle, and they needed a water element. And so it ends up playing all of these memorial strategies at once, not to good effect necessarily. They're not massaged into something coherent. And then they lose the sense of the path, I think, that Maya Lin created, that is maybe the most poignant part of the memorial. As to say, what the memorial is asking us to do is so powerful there.
Well, that's a great example of a memorial that is not an object. It's got an object, it's got a wall, but it's a place that forces you to descend a hill, and it gives you a timeline, an amazing timeline that begins in the middle and then cycles back. So beginning and end touch. There's a cosmic element to that. I read an article by the sociologist Nathan Glazer, who had an interesting observation about that. He said the only reason that really achieved that sublime height is that Maya Lin was 20 years old and she was not a fully arrived personality. So in a way, it's anonymous. She created it. But from then on, you would not have something that pure. You would have a Maya Lin the way you would have an Oldenburg or a Richard Serra, that it was somehow the emerging out of bland anonymity out of an architecture class where she hadn't yet developed a signature style, made it a monument of the people rather than the statement of an artist. I don't know, is that a useful distinction?
I think it gets somewhere, but I think there's a feminist retort to that I might not be the best person to make, but this is what it would be. And it's that Maya Lin immediately was dismissed by the committee that had chosen her and said, now we're going to bring in the big boys to execute it. And that pissed her off.
Yes.
And she dug in, and she was formed very quickly as an artist and as an advocate for herself, as a woman of small stature, to stand up and say, no, this is my idea and I'm going to execute it. And so I think there was a rapid process of change within her that made her formidable. And so in a way that the process of its making changed her and made the monument come out the right way. Because had she not been like that, had she not been formidable, if there wasn't something in her that told her to rise up and resist, essentially, that monument might have been altered from the beginning. And there was a plan right away to put a flagpole at that vertex right behind it, and to put the statue at the vertex right there. So you would have bumped into the statue, would have ruined everything. And she and others also said, no, we can't do that. So after some horse trading, luckily it was completed as it was.
Yep. Success story. What about the World Trade Center, Ground Zero, 9/11?
I've never been there. I have
Oh.
never been there because I had kids shortly thereafter, and I saw the site after it was made. I saw the site at various stages before that memorial was built, but I haven't been back to New York. Literally, I've not been to New York. So, but I've looked at it, I've taught it, I met the architect who gave a talk here, Michael Arad. And one of the things that was most interesting about his talk here for me was that he designed this standalone monument, which had a lot of the formal power that it currently has. So the initial idea was very close to what it is now. And then he showed it to his grandmother, who said, where am I going to sit? And he thought, oh, I had not thought of that. And then he started thinking about, in fact, some of the everyday things that people do at memorials, and started creating a larger scene, let's say. And so there, I think that this is not having been there, it seems to me that there are aspects of this memorial that are very effective, and that also invite everyday behavior. There's a wonderful New Yorker cover by Adrian Tomine, or Tomine, I don't know how to say his name, of people doing all sorts of things in front of the memorial, including some sort of solemn commemorative behavior, and others chewing bubblegum and shopping and, all the things that tourists do in public spaces. It's one big mixed up scene for Adrian Tomine. And that's a good memorial. I think it can serve many purposes at once.
Huh. Andy, how about this? Is the need to build a memorial a universal human impulse? Is it something that there's a list of human universals that sociologists have developed, and it is pretty much universal. It's in language. Every culture in the world has dance. Are memorials a universal? And if so, I mean, you have some pretty shifty, unhappy memorials in your book, I have to say. But leaving aside the issue of quality, is this something fundamentally connected with our deepest, our most archaic instincts to have memorials, and universal, therefore?
Yeah, so I'm uncomfortable with universals because I'm a historian, and I want to think in terms of contingencies and things that are relative. And this pushes us to the anthropological edge of what history is capable of discussing. But I do think that there are universals. I'm just, as a historian, I can't get at them through most historical techniques and strategies and methods. But what I do think is, putting the word memorial aside, I do think that people universally have consciousness of what comes after, and they understand the limitations of a lifespan. And they understand, say, that the timeline goes beyond them, even if it's cyclical. They imagine that there is something beyond them, and that the contemplation of the beyond, the contemplation of time, consciousness of time, and making things endure beyond our time, the fleeting time we're on Earth, that is a universal. To somehow mark that, to make it in material form, something that endures beyond us, I do think that that's a universal. Sometimes there are some cultures that make something that seems like it would endure, but it actually doesn't, and that's on purpose. So it's something that would degrade. It does last longer than a lifetime, but it might not last forever. So your forever might not be the same forever that somebody in another culture might have, but it still might get at that same idea that there's something beyond us that we want to reach for.
I see you're hesitant about anthropology, but anthropology is all through your book. You're looking at practices, and it makes me wonder, is there anything to be learned from the origin of the very first memorial, the crude menhirs and dolmens, and they're all over the world, but Korea has many menhirs, I just learned, and those tripart ones. So is there something there to go back to the origin of things, even before their cities? Is that something you've looked at all?
Not so closely. I teach it a little bit, but I don't teach it in a way that I'm convinced about. So one of the sites I teach that's related to the cultures that made those things in at least the British Isles are the passage tombs. And some of them, but not all of them, are set up to capture the shortest day of the year, the winter solstice. So they are thinking of cycles of time and their burial sites. So they are thinking of what happens after somebody's buried, what happens after they're dead. And we don't know enough about the people to know what their ideas of the afterlife were. But I do think that they're trying to get at something that goes beyond themselves, like I was discussing before. And they were doing it in a monumental form, and in a way that, one of the interesting moments that happens, I get this from Spiro Kostov, in some of these sites, is they start off as more private sites, and then they become more public. So at one of the ones I'm thinking of in Ireland, they built, after several hundred years, a platform out of stone at the entrance because they needed to accommodate crowds at some point, which is a change from a private form of interaction to a more public one. And that to me is a pivotal shift, because then the monument is serving a different purpose. It's a collective and it means something different.
Hmm. You know, you're one of the things that I know personally you are very interested in is the way a memorial is anchored physically to its place and then activated. And nothing activates place more than the movement of the sun and the sun striking an axis. And that would have been interesting to people before we had any structures at all. Certain trees or rocks casting a shadow. I'm always baffled when I walk my students around my campus and I say, which way is north? And people don't know now, because we don't need to know. We don't need to build our houses facing the south and for the heat of the sun. And I'm wondering if this is an untapped potential in modern and contemporary memorials, the use of the cycle of the year and of the day. Do you know, are there people using them that way?
I think, didn't Maya Lin do something that tapped into the sun and its ability to chart time? I have some memory of that, but I can't. I don't have a full memory of it. I think it could be to restore to us some sense of being of the world, you know. But pre-modern cultures who lived outside more were dependent on knowing the sun, and they were dependent on knowing the stars and the movement of the stars, because if you didn't set the seed at the right time of the year, you starved. So they had to count from the shortest day of the year to the first frost, or they were done. And that happens all over the world. Even in the tropics, there are cycles of some sort. There are rainy seasons and non-rainy seasons. So still some keen awareness of change of the natural cycle.
Well, Andy, that's a completely different thing than a place of remembrance to a fallen hero or a great man, woman. Is there anything to be said about that? The calendar memorial, the sacred calendar, and the enlarged tombstone.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said about it. You know, most of our memorials are ageographical. They're not rooted in a particular place. So there's an artificiality to them, which isn't bad. I'm not saying artificial in a pejorative way, right? So
except 9/11, which is
9/11 is, that's right.
That's police chalk lines right where it happened.
That's right. But every statue of Bismarck, more or less every statue of Bismarck, is an artifice, or of Lincoln or of Washington. And it's meant, in fact, to draw a set of lines between that place and the national narrative, let's say. And in that case, it's doing something important, but not the same thing that a monument in the place where something happened is doing. They're doing something different. The work is different. And so we should expect something different of them because of that. And the same thing happens with time, I suppose. If we artificially set up a day of remembrance that's not keyed to something that is organic, then we also have to work a little harder to make that meaningful. We have to take it out of the calendar like Memorial Day did. Why is it on a Monday? To have a 3-day weekend.
Yes.
Yeah.
And President's Day. And yes.
Yes.
All of our
It works with the schools. It works better with our secular culture to do that.
Yeah, exactly. Andy, is there is it possible that in an age of mass media, first radio, then television, then well, we are now the internet, is it possible that our ability to imaginatively to read allegorical objects has atrophied, that it requires a literary imagination to think sympathetically about what symbols mean and to derive a feeling from them? You don't get that in mass entertainment. You don't get it on television and YouTube. And is it possible that we've lost our capacity to read anything more complicated than an advertising poster, or we are losing it?
Yeah, so I guess that assumes that we all had that cultural literacy in some golden age. And I think it could be that allegory functioned differently for different people. So those who were well educated could read Shakespearean or biblical references better than those who were not. But there are Shakespeare was popular in 19th century America, and people knew by heart many of Shakespeare's better lines because they had seen plays even in small towns. So there was, let's say, a cultural literacy that allowed them to enter into the narrative of some of these pieces that were allegorical. And when allegory seems to die, it seems to die somewhere around World War II, a little earlier probably. With the modern movement, with the rise of abstraction in the early 20th century, it becomes less convincing. And then
Andy,
by World War II,
you astonish me. You said allegory dies the end of World War II. I'd never heard that. Yeah, I think you might be right.
Okay. And then Rothko says around 1942, there came a time where I could not draw a figure without mangling it. And it's done for that generation. The figure is no longer convincing for them. And so allegory can't be done. And allegory also seems to be very old-fashioned by, those middle decades of the 20th century. You see it in banknotes, you see it in stock dividends and things like that, but you don't see it in serious art anymore. But and this is a topic for another discussion, but my contention is that allegory doesn't die, it just goes underground and takes different forms. It's still operating in various ways, but not in high art, not in museums, not in the stuff that gets any attention in contemporary art circles. But I do think that allegorical imagination just has to go underground because I think it's necessary. I actually think little vignettes that allow us to construct narratives through vivid images and figures is still compelling and always will be compelling, because the human body, we're monkeys. We're interested in ourselves and in mirroring ourselves. And so I do think it's essential. And so we've prohibited something that's essential. That means it's repressed. That means it will return.
Andy, the Freudian. Well, our dreams are allegories. Every night we have a symbolic barrage of images that tell a story. I mean, the brain is
it's forbidden.
Oh, it's forbidden. Yeah.
How horrible it is that our very dreams are forbidden by the art establishment.
That is horrible. Now, listen, Andy, because in a minute we should turn it over to Kevin Block again, who's kindly going to bring up some of the questions from chat. One last question from you, Andy. You have a very distinctive writing style. Speaking of metaphoric language, you talk about statues drunk with time. Could you just tell them something about the tone of voice you adopted for this book? It's got a very distinctive authorial tone, different than other things you've written, and something about the use of language.
Yeah. So I don't think there's a single tone throughout. I think it's unfortunately a little more heterogeneous than I want it to be. But I set out to write something that was less formally academic and indulged. That's probably the best way to say it, because I don't want to say this too favorably. Indulged in something more fun, just to put it straightforwardly. I didn't want droll academic stuff. I didn't want to bore people, and I wanted the prose to move in a certain way. And all of that said, I was trained by people at Haverford College who I take to be modernist academic writers. Every bit of excess had to be cleaned off. It was just to the bones that you were supposed to write. And how many times did I have phrases, extra words excised from my writing, including by you when you taught me, I'm sure, but also by others. And so I was taught to be a modernist writer. But by that time, postmodern writing had already become fashionable. All the extra parenthesis and all the florid extras and all the game playing in language. And I would say that this book is an attempt to reconcile the two, right? There are moments where lean writing really is the most effective thing, and there are moments where one can have more of a flourish. I don't think I always choose the moments right, but I'm trying to.
Well, that is a beautifully terse summary of your writing style in this, and it clarifies things for me. It's a merger of the lean, laconic, lapidary style with the postmodern, a little more self-indulgent, but with none of the obnoxiousness, if I may say that, of much postmodern writing. I find it not off-putting. Yeah. Let me ask Kevin. Kevin, are we to take questions now through you?
Sure, yes. I'm just seeing one question, and I think because we have the ability, I can unmute the question asker so that you can hear from his or her own voice. So I see Penny Baker has submitted a question. So I'll look for you here and I'll unmute you, Penny, and allow you to speak directly to Andy and Michael. 1 second. Penny, can you unmute yourself?
Hi.
Hi, Penny.
Hi.
Penny's an
Great
old friend.
conversation. Thank you so much. Would the addition of Stonehenge and other sites into the conversation, would Walter D. Maria's lightning field be a candidate for a monument?
Andy?
Yeah, so I think that there are moments in the history of monuments, memorials, and public art where they get confused, and where it really doesn't matter to the committees approving them and placing them whether it is commemorative or not. But then I don't know if it always works the other way. So if that site became a site that was somehow commemoratively engaged, then it would start to become something closer to a memorial or a monument. Not knowing the site well enough, I don't know that that's what's happened there. I don't know if it's what Pierre Nora would call a lieu de mémoire, a site where people start to use it in some way, and it connects with a larger set of remembrances, let's say. So I have to profess too much ignorance on the subject. Mike, do you have a different answer?
No, that's interesting. I like that. I thought immediately, Penny, of Nancy Holt's sun tunnels, which is a
Mhm.
sewer pipes to a kind of Stonehenge through sewer pipes. But it's interesting that that's really a fine art object by an earth art sculptor. They take inspiration from Stonehenge, but they don't have the one thing that Stonehenge had, which is a culture that supports it, and that it which is manifested in physical terms. So I find them curiosities. It's interesting what these are far away though, that like Robert Smithson's spiral jetty, that they're pilgrimage sites that you go to. It's the pilgrimage that's the point, to see the attraction. But it's sort of a simulacrum or a facsimile. I find them in a strange way. I don't know what you think, Andy, a little desperate, trying to cling to some kind of cosmic meaning, but inventing it in your basement studio.
I'm probably more sympathetic to them as art objects, but I get what you're saying. I think that what they do is put the artifice of humanity starkly up against the non-artifice of nature, and then bring us to it to confront that. And that to me is interesting. I'm not sure how much earth you have to move to make that happen.
Interesting. Well, that's the way you just described it, gives it a tragic dimension, human tragedy, our smallness and the bigness of the land.
Some of them are like that, not all of them. Yeah.
Right. Penny, good question. We're going to talk about it later privately.
Okay, Lonnie Hovey just asked another question, and I will look for Lonnie as well. 1 second.
Hi, Andy.
Hi.
My question is, what are your thoughts on how the community of Richmond took over and transformed the Robert E. Lee Monument during the Black Lives Matter movement? They activated the monument in a very different way.
Yeah, so that was a monument that, let's say, wasn't so turned on until that happened.
Right.
And they turned it on. And I think the projection artist, Dustin Klein, and I forget the other gentleman who we worked with, I forget his name, when they started projecting images of great Black Americans on it, it was one of the most moving and iconic transformations of a statue I can ever remember.
Yep.
And of course, this is an old strategy too. This is something that has been done by counter monument makers in Berlin, say in the 1980s, 89, 90, right after the fall of the Berlin Wall. A guy named Shimon Atti, A-T-T-I-E, went there and started, he found archival images of Jews, found out where those people had been posing and projected them onto the buildings and created a big stir doing that. And so Dustin Klein did something similar, and it's, it's a political act and it's a commemorative act.
Right.
And I find those so moving. And look, the Robert E. Lee statue is now completely gone, but if it weren't gone, there'd be no way to see it again without imagining that gloss as another layer for anyone who had seen it.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks, Lonnie. Any other questions? I'm not seeing in the chat, but maybe someone would like to raise a hand.
Has the well run dry?
Marianne of SAH has a question.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm wondering, my friend Francis Maroney, when there was a big rush to memorialize 9/11, often said you need a period of time. He said the best Civil War monuments and memorials are put up in the 1890s. After there had been time to consider, who really needs a memorial. And now with the whole reaction to the Robert E. Lee statues, we're seeing a different side of that. But I've kind of always said that, you shouldn't be cast in bronze until you've been dead for about 25 years. And this really, came home to me as a Penn State alum, because they cast a statue of Joe Paterno, who is still alive and still coaching football, put it outside Beaver Stadium. And then the whole Jerry Sandusky scandal broke, and they had to sneak it away into a warehouse in the middle of the night. So what, is there a better timeline for establishing these memorials, or does it just depend on the situation?
I think the latter. I think it really depends on the situation. So after the Persian Wars, after Athens was destroyed, Pericles says we should wait 50 years to rebuild the holiest place, which is the Acropolis, the temples on the Acropolis. There should be a 50-year moratorium, and that the ruins will serve as a memorial, essentially. They had the maturity to propose it, but not the maturity to carry it through. So they did rebuild earlier than that. And I thought of that a lot after the World Trade Center was brought down. And I thought, will New York have the maturity to wait at all? And the early proposals showed that they didn't, that they wanted all sorts of crazy reproductions of it, build it the same but 1 inch taller, build it back but in gold, things like that, which were really immature responses. And I'm not sure that what happened is even the most mature response. But I do think that some sense of stepping back from something is terribly important. I don't know what to do in the case of say the Confederate memorials, where we have a political awakening. How long do we wait? How do we structure that waiting? What do we do as we wait? Because we can't just wait inertly. We have to wait in some way that's actually meaningful. So the waiting cannot just be the way you wait for a license to come in the mail to do something, right? But I do think that there are also cycles of commemoration to get to a totally different answer to your question. So that the generation that, say, fought in a war comes of age because they were boys when they fight, 18 to 22 years old. 25 years later, they're midlife, and then 50 years later, they're old people, and they've made their mark, and they, in some sense, are thinking about what will happen after they're dead. And those commemorative cycles tend to be really engaging moments for communities to erect memorials. 25 and 50-year cycles are really key moments in the erection of memorials.
Andy, it makes me think of the great interest and concern for the greatest generation in the mid-90s, which is
That's
when
exactly right.
you're thinking of that, they built the World War II Memorial. And then Lincoln, the Lincoln, interesting, the Lincoln Memorial, I believe, is sublime. I think it's fantastic, just fantastic. But that took them a good 60 years. And all the ones built right after his assassination tend to be sentimental vignettes of him signing the Emancipation Proclamation. They're not great. They're book illustration. But it makes me think of Rodin's great statement that when they asked him, what is a sculpture? And he said, when you roll a statue down the steps, what you find at the bottom, that's sculpture. All the arms and nose break off. You have a compact torso. The distractions go away. I think 50 years. I didn't know that Pericles said that. That's amazing.
One half of Pericles believed that, the other half decided that he wanted to rule in a different way. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, Kevin, it's been almost an hour.
Yeah,
At the
I
end,
think we are. Thanks so much. I'm going to, no more questions. I'll pass it over to Veronica, but before I do, just thanks again to both of you. And I'll just hold up your book again, Andy, and remind everyone that the link is in the chat and there's much more to read about. So I do recommend you take a look at it.
Kevin, because you've blurred your screen, you are moving around a blurry picture of the abominable snowman. We cannot, now there we see it. That's
Yeah. There we go.
Here we go. Sorry about that. Thanks, Michael.
Well, that's wonderful. And thank you, Kevin, for that. Well, I would like to thank Kevin for the introductions and the moderation, and to thank both of our speakers, Andy Shanken and Mike Lewis. It's been a treat to have you with us, and so thank you both so much. To all of our audience, thank you for joining us. Again, I'm Veronica Oplins, president of the Philadelphia chapter of the Society of Architectural Historians. We invite you to join our other programs, and if you enjoyed this program or missed any part of it, feel free to pop onto our website, and in a short period of time, this recording will be uploaded to it. So thank you, and good evening to you all.
Thank you. Thank you both. Thank you, Kevin.